All right, something different today. So far, I've been talking through the first 4 or 5 chapters of Techniques of My Musical Language, which is a treatise written by the French composer Olivier Messiaen. I'm going to take a break from that today and instead give a book review. The book under review, Messiaen the Theologian, edited by Andrew Shenton. I say book review, it's really more like a book report, or more like even, what did I learn as I read this book? Why did I read it? What led me to it? And what are the key points that I enjoyed as I read the book? So I found the book because I was Googling around for information about some terms that Messiaen uses in the techniques. The charm of impossibilities. And I was particularly interested in that term, the charm of impossibilities. I used it to refer to modes of limited transposition in the harmonic domain and non-retrogradable rhythms in the rhythmic domain. So by all means, go back and check the episodes 1 through 4 or 5 where dig into that a lot more. But I was charmed by the term charm of impossibilities. I wanted to know more about what he might mean by that. And so I went to JSTOR, the academic database, searched around a bit, and found what turned out to be the introduction to this book, what Andrew Shenton had written to describe the project and the organization of the essays in the book. But the essays themselves are not published independently as articles. So I found the book. It's an academic book, so it was a bit on the pricey side, but I thought this is something that I'm going to spend some time with. So I purchased it, and then, I don't know, there's a couple dozen essays in there. I've read carefully through 4 or 5 of them. I've read most of them. And the ones that I haven't read are the ones that are really heavy on medieval theology, which, to be honest, is not where I'm at. What I'm going to do today is just walk through the essays that really captivated me, and what did I take away from those essays, and try to bring it all together. So that's my approach to a book review. I'm not looking to see whether it's good or bad. It's actually a fine book, and I heartily recommend it for those of you who are interested in further reading on Messiaen. There are academic papers, so they're a bit on the dry side. But for the most part, I found them quite readable, and I have no qualms about marking up books, which always makes it more entertaining when I've got my own scribbles and exclamation points and commentary in the background. So I found the book because the introduction was available on JSTOR as an article. JSTOR, by the way, is definitely worth checking out. When you first look at it, it seems very intimidating. It looks like you either need to have an institutional account, or you need to pay like, I don't know, $20, $30 to get each article, to download them. But you can actually get an independent researcher membership. When you look to join it, you can set yourself up as a member of a faculty or student at a school or whatever your affiliation is. But there's an option for independent research. And if you choose that, then for like $19.95 for a month, you can download unlimited articles. I don't know if it's truly unlimited. It might be 100 or something like that. But look, so for $20, and then it's not automatically renewed. So I've maintained mine for a couple of months, but then I did let it lapse for a few months, and then when I wanted to go back and do a bit more research, I joined back up again. And so for $20, you get the downloads, and I go in and I do some searching and download a bunch of articles, put them on my laptop, and then over the course of a month or two, I'll read through them. And most of them, to be honest, I end up leaving early on in the article, but there's always something. There's always something there to get from. And the book is organized in some main sections, all addressing this question of Messiaen as a theologian, Messiaen the Theologian. So the sections are organized loosely around issues in Catholicism, contemporary with Messiaen. Messiaen was, of course, a professional church musician and deeply committed to the liturgy, not only as his own compositional inspiration, but also as a believer and as a participant in the liturgy with his music. So he was very aware of political and doctrinal discussions taking place in the church. There is a section on how the music that Messiaen writes addresses issues of faith as a commentary, as a representation, as a supporting tool. And some of that is mentioned in the treatise in the Techniques of My Musical Language, Messiaen's objectives with writing the music. There are sections on how to interpret the music based on this understanding, and then there's information around key figures. And so those broad sections structure the book. And I was particularly interested in the interpretation pieces. So this essay that baited the hook, that brought me into the acquisition of this collection, is by Stephen Schlosser, and it is called The Charm of Impossibilities, Mystic Surrealism as Contemplative Voluptuousness. Now, who could resist a title like that? I certainly could not resist a title like that. Now, I had come to this essay having seen the term used in chapters on non-retrograde rhythm and modes of limited transposition, where Messiaen describes these musical techniques as particularly useful for his music to create this sense of unity. Right? When there is limited rhythmic motion, which is what happens when the rhythm is non-retrogradable, when it's the same forwards as backwards. And when the harmony is constrained in the number of transpositions, and therefore the number of different tones, pitches that can be present, then you get this sense of stasis in those domains, in the rhythmic and harmonic domain. And so then that propels you into an awareness of the temporal domain, which is the issue with much of Messiaen's music, is this immanentization of space outside time. So I came to this essay thinking that we would dig into some more examples and some more discussion on the technique of that music. But of course, the collection is a theological collection. And so although there are many wonderful examples, snippets of scores in the book, the end take of it is not musically theoretical. And that's not a criticism. It's ended up being an eye-opening set of information that really has enhanced my understanding of not just the music, but the technique of the music. So what I took away from this first essay, which is actually the 9th essay, but there's no reason to read these things in any kind of linear sense. We are, after all, at the end of time. There are a number of... Listen to that. I wish I could synthesize a sound like that, a sound that had that richness richness of harmony and implied rhythm, but also that sense of distance and change. I could build that up in my Eurorack modular synth gear. I would consider that a day's work well spent. So what is this article really about then? I think it describes the poetic, philosophical, theological ideas that were circulating around Messiaen, that you would have picked up on, that gave flavor to that initial musical impetus. Those influences are mystical from the church, right? They are surrealist. They are surrealist and symbolist from poetry. And they all combine into this sense of wonder, transcendence, and the idea that within the world are these correspondences and reflections of a reality that's beyond what we immediately perceive with our eyes and senses. In fact, that word correspondences, I used it deliberately. It's a word that Baudelaire, the French poet, used. Is the symbolist idea is that true reality can only be pointed to. We can catch apperceptions of the pattern. We can receive hints, vague transmissions that if we try to grasp will evaporate, but taken as a whole provide this aura around us of meaning that is an extension of the physical reality that we are comfortable with. I mentioned Baudelaire. Mallarmé is another French symbolist. Titles, labels are dumb, right? But they are useful, and I'm actually quite fond of them. I would like to be called a symbolist composer. And of course, Messiaen's mother, Cécile Sauvage, was a poet who I think you could say was in that milieu, that symbolist milieu. In the very first episode, I read one of her poems because in the introduction to Techniques of My Musical Language, Messiaen lists an enormous set of influences, religious, poetic, political, and one of them is Cécile Sauvage, along with Paul Revardy. These are poets who he knew and loved. So that's symbolism. Surrealism, the distinction I confess to not ever having really been particularly clear on, but I think a way of summarizing surrealism, at least the summary that I acquired from reading this essay, is that whereas symbolists will point to the reality with these hints and whispers, surrealists will manipulate the material of the present and of the current to create something bizarre and uncanny, that you can foreground the uncanny, and that's the expression that Schlosser uses in the essay. Surrealism will foreground the uncanny. Keep Messiaen in mind with all of this. Remember that he wants to bring your experience of his music into this context. The music is foregrounding the uncanny. It is pointing towards the unseeable elements of reality. That's quite a good find from an article, and there's a lot more in there. The piece I take to end it is actually how Schlosser begins the essay, again, because I read things backwards. The idea of the composer as someone who comments on liturgical text is immensely important to Messiaen's self-definition, right? And in his writings about it. This is very clearly a position that he's taken. Schlosser points out that Charles Tournemire, Charles Tournemire. Tournemire? Charles Tournemire provided a model for Messiaen. Tournemire was a church organist, and he worked on a piece called L'Orgue Mystique. L'Orgue Mystique, which is commentary on the orders of the Catholic Church. It's an immense piece. I know nothing about it except that it keeps coming up in my readings about Messiaen. And so Messiaen clearly influenced by the idea of a church organist commenting on the text with this magisterial opus. So again, to wrap up my summary of this 9th essay, the first one I read, The Charm of Impossibilities, some quotes from Messiaen where he is paraphrasing Thomas Aquinas. He says, "God dazzles us by an excess of truth. Music transports us to God by an absence of truth." So that's Messiaen paraphrasing Aquinas. And then Messiaen responds to that. For the Surrealists, it was a hallucinatory domain. For Christians, it is the domain of faith. They haven't seen, but they have a secret intuition about what they don't see. Now, I think music, even more than literature and painting, is capable of expressing this dreamlike, fairy tale aspect of the beyond, this surreal aspect of the truths of faith. So having read that essay, which is the 9th essay in the book, I turned my attention to the rest of them, and I was sort of flipping through, and actually ended up on essay 8, the one just prior to the chapter that had brought me into the book. And this was a equally charming title, The War Quartets of T.S. Eliot and Olivier Messiaen. Look, I think the idea of the essay here is admittedly a bit fanciful. There's no evidence that Messiaen and Eliot knew each other's work. There's certainly no explicit connection. But there are some interesting overlaps. Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, Eliot speaks of the still point. So Eliot, like Messiaen, is occupied with the idea of time and the position of time and the overlap of the human and the time and the end of time. And in both Eliot and Messiaen, the end of time is not a chronological event. It is not the destruction of all things. It is a position outside of time. Right? Eliot talks about the still point. And one of the voices in the 4 quartets, right? One of the ways of reading the 4 quartets is there are 4 individual poems, but within those poems there are distinct voices. One of those voices returns to that equation. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in the future. Time future contained in time past. In my copy of this book, I've tried to draw that out. I'll see if I can dig that up, include it here. But later, right, so that time present and time past cadence recurs throughout Burton Norton, often with slightly different emphasis. So, for example, time past and time future, what might have been and what has been, point to one end, which is always present. So where I particularly love these poems, the Elliot poems, is where he is explicit in the model of music as a realization of that time bindedness, that bound in time sense. Here's Eliot. There's only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time, the distraction fit, lost in a shaft of sunlight, the wild time unseen, or the winter lightning, or the waterfall, or music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all. Only by the form, the pattern, can words or music reach the stillness, as a Chinese jar still moves, perpetually in its stillness. The still point, the end of time. There's a conceptual overlap. So Shenton ends his essay, which is a lovely essay. I mean, the ideas that are in the quartet for the end of time, the music, and the four quartets, the poems, really do bounce off each other in a wonderful way. And I had never made that connection before. I don't think I even would have thought of them as being as contemporary as they are. They were written within a year of each other. So Shenton ends the essay with a quote from Auden, another of my favorite poets. So you can see this really is a poem or an essay that you could leave lying around, and it would be emitting pheromones that would draw me to it, probably from miles away, like a shark sensing blood in the water, or a cat sensing catnip on the ground, or a cat hearing the tuna can opening from across the house. So here's Auden from one of his essays. You cannot tell people what to do. You can only tell them parables. And that is what art really is. Particular stories of particular people and experiences, from which each, according to his immediate and peculiar needs, may draw his own conclusions. Very nice. So as I mentioned, there's, I don't know, maybe 20 essays in this collection. I probably read a dozen of them, and the two that I've talked about are the ones that really made the collection, gave me the most immediate what I was looking for. But I certainly learned a lot from the other essays that I read, and I'm just going to talk about a third just to wrap up here, because it's from the section where more specifically talking about Messiaen as a theologian, right? So the essays that I was looking at helped understand the inspirations, or at least the structure, maybe, of what Messiaen meant by the charm of impossibilities, and how he was considering his music in that role, how to think about the music within that context, and maybe to explain why Messiaen was using some of the techniques that he's developed in the particular manner that he does use them. He's looking for particular experience for the listener that points to the faith or the surreal or the symbols. But there is also a theological aspect to Messiaen. He had his own beliefs and ideas that are expressed in the music. So you get the difference, right? Commenting. So this difference was clarified for me by the second essay in the collection by Peter Bannister. Isn't Peter Bannister the Incredible Hulk? I don't know. Anyway, the title of the essay is Messiaen as Preacher and Evangelist in the Context of European Modernism. So that's pretty heavy. But I did get some useful insights out of this article. And the first, and really the one that stays with me, and in fact it stays with me enough that I would use what I'm about to say as a summary of this book in general. And I'm not even going to paraphrase. I'm just going to read the first paragraph of this essay because it's quite wonderful. Since the work of Bach scholars Philipp Spitta and Albert Schweitzer in the late 19th century, it has become a truism in discussions of sacred music that there are 5 rather than 4 Christian evangelists, the 5th being the author of the St. Matthew and St. John Passions, the B minor Mass, and the mere matter of over 1,000 other pieces. I'm talking about Bach, of course. Curiously, when asked by Brigitte Masson whether he would appreciate the epithet the Bach of modern times, Olivier Messiaen replied somewhat ambiguously, I suppose I ought to take it as a very great compliment. It would be undeserved. When then asked by Masson whether he could detect a resemblance between himself and the Leipzig Thomas Cantor, his answer was a categorical no, Not at all. So I freaking love that. Messiaen the sixth Evangelist. It's great. Okay, so then the context of European modernism. The idea here then is that throughout the essay, Messiaen, deeply spiritual, writing music that is intentionally liturgical, with obvious religiosity, in the context of European post-war modernism, and certainly was, although he has had a very successful career, there were criticisms leveled against him for the language that he used to describe his music, and for some of the content of the music itself. He has no qualms about using very simple, obvious ideas in an enormously profound way, and in the hands of a lesser composer, it might sound like shit. So this idea of existing as a professional musician in the world of post-war Surrealism and other advances in musical composition theory, advocated by his students, for example, like Pierre Boulez, Messiaen never lost his relevance. And although he uses serial techniques in his pieces, they are an effect that he brings in for a specific impact. And the bit I'll leave from this essay is this quote from Messiaen's journals. It demonstrates how even when Messiaen is thinking very technically from his musical perspective, either from the techniques that he describes in Techniques of My Musical Language, or when he's considering Surrealism, absolute Surrealism of rhythm as well as Surrealism of pitch, right? The kinds of things that composers in the 40s and 50s were thinking about. Even when Messiaen is thinking about those aspects, he has a different objective in mind, and that's represented by this journal entry from 1946. So it's a journal entry, so it's not complete sentences. Large orchestra, write a ballet on time. It is night on stage, a dancer, a man completely still, the creation of time. An angel with a rainbow halo enters, with a fearsome head. Eyes rolled upwards to the beyond, no body, 2 Greek columns ablaze instead of legs. And holy shit, what a symbol. Talk about symbol. Surreal. The manipulation of the content of the present in front of us. 2 Greek columns ablaze instead of legs. A hand which emerges from the clouds. The sun and a rainbow surrounding the head. A hallucinatory figure. When it appears, the man dances. It is time. Then the man stops still. The end of time. He stands with his arms stretched out, not moving. Chords and resonances like those in my quatuor. So he's referencing his early piece, the quartet. And a serial theme, right? Surrealism is a gesture, a technique to be used. A serial theme, it's not an organizational concept for the whole piece. It's a artifact that can be included. A serial theme giving a series of 12 notes and a series of timbres, 1 for each note, and 1 duration and 1 nuance for each note. Develop timbres, durations, and nuances according to the principles of Surrealism. And then there's an ellipses, and then listen to this sentence. Think of the star which opens the well to the abyss. Think of the star which opens the well to the abyss. So Messiaen never wrote this opera, or this ballet, but I sure as hell want to. And that last sentence, the star which opens the well to the abyss, is like, it's like a laser beam. Freaking love it. So that's in a section called Baptizing the Language of Modernism. And you can kind of see that, right? Surrealism immersed into this sort of chalice of the chords and resonance of the quartet, which we know are based on limited transposition, non-retrogradable rhythms, and the organization of repetition augmentation. So, Messiaen the Theologian by Andrew Shenton, or edited by Andrew Shenton. The essays that I read were by Andrew Shenton. He wrote the War Quartet one. Stephen Schlosser, Contemplative Voluptuousness. And then Peter Bannister, Taking a Break from the Incredible Hulk. It isn't Peter Bannister, is it? It might be. So if you like this, let me know in the comments if you have any questions. I should have said at the beginning of the video. No one makes it this far. But if you did, drop a comment. Let me know what you thought. Any questions? Love to have a dialogue about this. If you like the idea of occasional book reports, book reviews, book reactions. I should call this a reaction. That apparently is a good way to get YouTube algorithm recommendations if I call it reaction. Composer reacts to Messiaen, something like that. I did just read a relatively recent biography of Messiaen, Peter Hill and Nigel Simeon, who I believe have essays in that collection, but the biography is special because they had first access to the papers that Yvonne Loriot has maintained. Messiaen's wife maintained his papers. So, for example, that journal entry that I read at the end there is available now because of that biography that was published. So we'll be back in a couple of weeks, back into the techniques, back at the piano, back playing examples. So thank you all very much, and I will check you all later.